New U.S. forced labor tariffs target Canada. Again. Okay, so this has happened before. Uh, could a new 10% tariff on Canadian goods be the Trump administration's most legally bulletproof trade weapon yet? All right. Prime Minister Mark Carney says he isn't surprised by the Trump administration's plan to slap additional import levies on goods allegedly made with forced labor. What? Like, is this like a blanket 10% tariff? Last time I checked, like, I don't think there's any forced labor in Canada. Like, let's finish. Let's go through it, and then I'll ask questions. A report released from U.S. Trade Representative Jimson Greer office listed dozens of countries, including Canada, as having varying degrees of ineffective enforcement rules around goods made with forced labor. The investigation into forced labor were launched in March as an effort to shore up Trump's tariff policies after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down his Liberation Day tariff. Oh, this is an excuse for tariffs. So there's probably there's no hurdle to prove forced labor. There's no requirement to prove forced labor, I'm assuming. And so if you just say, oh, there's forced labor here, you can put tariffs on it legally. Even though there's no burden of proof to prove any kind of forced labor. That's what I'm going to guess for now. Let's continue. In response to the top court's February ruling, Trump implemented a 10% worldwide tariff using Section 122 of the 1978 Trade Act. Okay, so these are the ones we know of that got shut down, right? Like, these ones got shut down, and he has to pay the money back. And that's a disaster from what I'm understanding. But those duties expired after 150 days unless Congress voted to extend them. Okay, these are different ones. Man, there's so many tariffs. His first ones were shut down and he had to pay those back. And so this is the second set of them. But these ones expired after 150 days. So now he needs to find a new excuse for tariffs. Meanwhile, Canada sent a letter to the United States and Mexico outlining recommendations to renew the trilateral CUSMA trade agreement for 16 years, while seeking parallel talks on sectoral tariffs. So steel and aluminum tariffs, probably. Canada's minister responsible for Canada-U.S. trade, Dominic LeBlanc, met with USTR, United States Trade Representative. Right? Yeah, U.S. Trade Representative. Jamison Gear, a meeting that came after Canada was left out of bilateral talks between the U.S. and Mexico the prior week. Canada's economy remains heavily dependent on the U.S., with nearly 70% of its exports heading south of the border. Absolutely. This is the new front of the trade war, and unlike the IEEPA tariff struck down by the Supreme Court, these Section 103 tariffs have more solid legal foundation. With 70% of Canada exports going to the US, the stakes for Canada's economy and Carney's still new Liberal government are very high. Okay, so let's start. So these are new tariffs, right? What are these new tariffs called? How do I refer to them? Like, from my understanding, these still doesn't, like, this still won't affect the CUSMA stuff, because that's like a free trade deal we have, right? Let's check that. I hear that Trump has issued new 10% tariffs on Canadian goods. Does this include goods that are covered by CUSMA? Canada, US, Mexico. Yeah, the Trump has issued a new 10% tariffs on. Man, this punctuation is horrible. Let's just see. Does this include like CUSMA products? I don't know if you can tariff those. Like that's like a free trade deal, right? The short answer is no. It does not include goods that are fully compliant with CUSMA, which is the vast majority of goods outside of steel and aluminum, from my understanding. The news 10% tariff announced by the U.S. Trade Representative following an investigation into forced labor in global supply chain come with a specific carve out for CUSMA compliant goods. Oh, so they specifically state it doesn't cover CUSMA. Trade is protected by it. CUSMA exemption. Because CUSMA already includes strict legal binding provisions requiring Canada, the US, and Mexico to prohibit the importation of goods produced by forced labor, products that meet the trade agreement's rules of origin and compliance standards are exempt. Prime Minister Mark Carney noted that because of this carve out, the tariffs will not have an impact on the vast majority of Canadian exports flowing south. Why is the US doing this now? The tariff stems from a Section 301 investigation under the US Trade Act of 1974. The White House is using this mechanism to target countries, including Canada, the US, Mexico, and Taiwan, that it argues are not doing enough to actively enforce and police their own import bans on forced labor goods. Okay, so the complaint isn't that Canada has forced labor. The complaint is that Canada is importing goods that could be created with forced labor, and then through trade, those goods may end up in the American market. Let me see if I got this right. So, the American complaint is that Canada doesn't have enough import controls over goods that could be coming from forced labor, and then those goods could end up in the US, and so they're putting a tariff on products from Canada. Let's see what it says. Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. That is the precise logic the Trump administration is using. The U.S. Trade Representative basically argued that when America's trading partners don't strictly police their own borders for forced labor products, those cheap illicit goods can leak into regional supply chains. In their view, this forces American workers and businesses who have to comply with strict U.S. domestic import bans to compete on unlevel playing fields. Okay. Can I open another instance of Claude? 'Cause I do like Claude. Here we go. Don't use all the tokens. Okay. I forgot my question now. Does Canada do a good job preventing goods from countries with forced labor from entering their market? Can you compare what Canada does to what America does to prevent these goods from entering their market? Because that's our complaint. What country does a better job policing these types of goods? We'll see. Yeah, I got through all that. The carrot and the stick, by finding that Canada has partial ban but isn't enforcing it well enough. Okay, the US lumped Canada into a lower 10% tariff tier. Countries they accuse of having no real bans at all, like China and India, are facing a higher 12.5% rate. I mean, this is just the continuation. Like, Trump's used tariffs as a weapon since he started, right? I mean, he's not going to change what he's doing. The Kuzma Shield. Because Kuzma already has built-in legally binding rules against forced labor, any Canadian good that are fully certified as Kuzma compliant bypass this entirely. The 10% tariff would only catch goods moving across the border that fail to meet those strict North American origin rules. It is a high stakes game of trade leverage. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government is already moving to introduce new supply chain legislation this month to satisfy the U.S. complaints before the public comment window closes in July. What percentage of trade from Canada to the U.S. is Kuzma compliant? This is generally interesting and timely comparison. Here's a thorough breakdown. The legal framework. Canada has legally prohibited on importing goods made with forced labor or child labor under its custom tariff. And in January 2024, it took a notable step forward with the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor and Supply Chains Act. This law made Canada the first country in the world to ban the import of goods made with child labor, a bold and controversial move. The act also requires covered Canadian entities to release broad approved reports detailing their efforts to prevent and mitigate forced labor and child labor in the supply chains, with reporting requirements starting May 31st, 2024. So it does sound like Canada's on this. Ooh, the enforcement problem. Despite the strong legal language, the enforcement record is embarrassingly thin. Since 2021, the Canada Border Services Agency has only seized 2 shipments of goods. Oh. That's basically like not enforcing it at all. 2 shipments of good made using forced labor. The shipment of textile products in 2024, a shipment of frozen seafood in 2025. 2 seizures in 4 years for a G7 economy with hundreds of billions in annual imports is widely considered a failure. The gap is significant enough that Canada has drawn scrutiny from its own trade partners. Okay, so this is what it's talking about. In its 2026 National Trade Estimate Report on Foreign Trade Barriers, the U.S. government alleged that Canada failed to prevent foreign goods made with forced labor from entering the U.S. market. The U.S. has even launched a formal investigation into whether Canada's inadequate enforcement effectively allows tainted goods to flow into North America's supply chains. Reforms underway. Canada has acknowledged the problem and is promising change. Canada's 2024 fall economic strategy proposed $25.1 billion over 2 years to implement legislative amendments to strengthen the import ban, with the government intending to amend the ban to impose an onus on importers to demonstrate that their supply chains are free from forced and child labor, which may closely resemble the reverse onus in place in the United States under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Okay, America, far more robust with more teeth. Legal framework, the U.S. approach is more aggressive, built around the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Okay, let that word's come up a couple times. We will get a verdict.
Uyghur.
Oh, the Uyghurs. How is that Uyghurs?
Uyghur.
Is this English? I don't see how that's Uyghur, but I'm just gonna have to remember it, aren't I? The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So Uyghurs, the group in China that is thought to be used as forced labor, at least by several international reports. There are reports of forced labor in the Uyghur community in China. Anyway, signed in December 2021, it's established a rebuttal presumption that goods produced wholly or in part in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China are made with forced labor and prohibited from importation. And enforcement began on June 21st, 2022. The key phrase is rebutable presumption. The burden of proof is flipped onto the importer to prove goods are clean, not on the government to prove they aren't. Oh, so that's the different with the American system and the Canadian system. It's the government that has to prove they aren't, which is hard to do. It's like hard to track. Like you can't track every shipment and see the factory it came from. Like the investment you would have to do in order to prove that is too high. The government's not going to build that out. So having the burden of proof flipped to the importer to prove the goods are clean, you're going to find a lot like that. That's just a better way of doing it, because the importer is the one making money off this. Therefore, if you force them to go through a step of compliance, they're incentivized to do that because they're incentivized to make the money off the import. So you can ask them for a higher burden of proof. The enforcement record. The numbers tell a dramatically different story than Canada's. As of August 2025, U.S. Customs and Border Protection has detained 16,755 shipments valued at nearly $3.7 billion, suspected of violating the UFLPA. The targeted goods have spanned textiles, apparel, luxury vinyl, solar panels, electronics, and more. I mean, it does sound like they are, if you think about it, US 10, rough hand 10 times the size of Canada, right? So if we have a similar, if we were doing a similar level of enforcement, you would see 1,600 out of Canada, like 1,600 shipments out of Canada, and what is it? 2? There's been 2 seizures. I don't remember where it was written. Yeah, 2 shipments of goods compared to 16,755. Like, they might have a point on this one. The enforcement apparatus is substantial. The Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force is an interagency body that includes the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Labor, State, Treasury, Justice, Commerce, and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. The UFLPA entity lists has grown from the initial 20 entities named in the 2022 strategy to 68 entities as of the most recent updates. And the FLETF has identified new high priority sectors for enforcement, including polyvinyl chlorine, aluminum, and seafood. Okay. Real world impacts. The enforcement is measurably affecting China's behavior. At China's National People's Congress in March 2025, a senior Politburo official spoke publicly for the first time about the negative effects of the UFLPA and other sanctions were having on business, pointing specifically to the 144 Chinese entities on the UFLPA and entity list and calling the sanctions one of the biggest challenges in the region's development. I mean, oh, that's tough because when you look at a factory in a very poor place in the world, um, the conditions are going to look like forced labor. They are like it. It's really I don't know. Like who's vetting if these entities are forced labor, right? But in the end, like if you end up on the list, that's just how it is. You got to meet their standards, and I think in the end that's a good thing. Um, to have like work standards for allowing goods into your market, um, because conditions can be terrible in places in the world. Yeah. Okay. Who does it better? The United States by a wide margin. There's little ambiguity here. The U.S. significantly outperforms Canada on every meaningful metric. The law, the burden of proof. Yeah, in Canada, the burden of proof is on the government to prove. And in the United States, it's on the importer. But they were looking at changing this, right? Canada's. The government intends to amend the ban to impose an onus on importers to demonstrate that their supply chains are free from forced and child labor. This is the one that works. This is the one that they use, and it is far more successful. Honestly, like go through their entity list. I imagine like they're probably open with that, right? And then just the same entities, and then if you want to, depending on if you want to have higher or lower standards slightly, you can change the entities slightly, but probably copying those 68 entities is a good first step. Shipments 2. 2. that's almost depressing, guys. Come on. Limited resource dedicated. They have a 13 agency integrated task force. Oh, they're up to 144 named entities. Oh, just copy that. Criticized as inadequate under formal investigation. Okay, that said, Canada is not standing still. The proposed reforms, especially mirroring the U.S. reverse onus model, could meaningfully close the gap if actually implemented and funded. Canada's child labor ban goes further in scope than the U.S. framework, but as it stands today, enforcement is where it really counts, and the U.S. is in a different league. We should enforce it. Like, what's the point of having the law and then not meaningfully enforce the law? Like, you're making a law. Oh yeah, we don't have goods here from forced labor or from child labor. Well, how do you know that? We made a law. Well, where's the enforcement? We made a law. We got 2 since 2021, and if the U.S. has gotten 16,755 in the same time frame, you're looking at our number should be around 1,600, and it is just not there. It is not there. That law is currently meaningless. Hey, well that's definitely something we gotta get on top of. Which, I mean, like, if Trump puts tariffs on you because of that, you're forced to figure it out. I mean, what's the point of having a law if you're not going to enforce it? Okay, well, we're going to move on. Hopefully Canada can get this under control, and I mean, just that'll take an investment into the enforcement. We already have the law in place. just copy the U.S. entity list for what they consider forced labor, and we can go from there.